Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. Today's episode explores communication at the intersections of care, culture, and crisis, and what it really means to rebuild after disaster. I'm joined by Dr. Sara Potter, whose work examines culture-centered humanitarian aid, feminist organizing, and maternal and infant care, particularly in post-disaster contexts. Drawing from fieldwork following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, Dr. Potter's research centers women's voices and the often invisible labor they take on to sustain families and communities when formal systems fail. We talk about feminist organizing, motherwork, and what she calls the next new normal, as well as her current community-engaged work responding to women's healthcare deserts here in the U.S. This conversation reminds us that recovery isn't just about infrastructure. It's about relationships, communication, and care. Today's guest is a scholar whose work sits at the intersection of culture, gender, and humanitarian aid. She has spent years researching Puerto Rican mothers in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, examining how they rebuilt daily life, created networks of care, and showed incredible resilience in the face of systemic failures. Her recent and ongoing projects explore how women organize support, develop grassroots solutions, and push local systems to adapt, whether after a disaster or in preparation for the next one. She's now extending that work to maternal health in the Upper Peninsula, partnering with midwives, doulas, and community leaders to address the growing women's health care desert. How are you doing this morning, I guess for me, Dr. Sara Potter?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. We're busy. We're getting close to break and finals and wrapping up another manuscript and thinking about, finishing up an IRB. So we're good, but we're, as most professors know, the beginning and the end it's a mysterious land of chaos. So good.
Absolutely. I just talked about this with a recent guest of mine, but it seems like post fall break, and I don't know when your guys' fall break is or if you have one, but like post fall break is when everyone kind of just gets into like holiday mode, slowly but surely. So it's like you start slowly losing them week by week, and you can tell that winter break's getting closer. And it's just harder to get motivated, and everything seems a lot harder to like do and finish, and the to-do list get longer, and we're in it. That's like the phase we're in.
We have no fall break.
Okay.
So they go 14 weeks.
14 weeks straight, yeah. Yeah.
So you do, I almost wish we had a fall break, because then I would expect, to lose them. Like, you're like, okay, we're back on track. Here we are. But
exactly.
Yeah, you hit the 8-week mark. And yeah, my list, you can't see it, but my list to do somewhere around here are never ending.
Never ending. Well, your work is absolutely fascinating. And I'm kind of just going to get us started. Like, what first drew you to studying maternal and infant care through the particular lens of like the intersection of culture, gender, and humanitarian aid?
Yeah, so as I would tell other people, I sort of stumbled up the stairs into this. It was like serendipitous in a way, accidental in a way, ironic in a lot of other ways. A mix of like research curiosity and personal experience. I've been in my career, whether it was at my master's program or here teaching at Northern, for about 15 years. And I've done dozens of conference presentations and mentored college students in lots of projects that were at that intersection, as you mentioned here, of gender and culture, and I would say change or social justice, particularly at that time, whether it's the transgender coming out narratives, or women's rights movement, or this, like, I did this really cool project with 3 generations of women's narratives around their decision to have or not have children. But in terms of how all that kind of coalesced together, it wasn't really until I went back to get my PhD, and I had this just gift of amazing professors that went, wait a second, I see that, I see that, I see that. Here's how all these pieces of your life that really didn't at the time feel intersecting overlap or maybe even contradict. And, kind of motivated and inspired me to do extra reading or, take different classes that wouldn't have normally been on my list of things that I would have ever considered. The humanitarian aid and the maternal infant angle kind of came later. My husband and I are, it's sort of deeply personal, but my husband and I had our honeymoon kind of ruined by some tropical storms. And so we were like, let's do a re-honeymoon for our 10th wedding anniversary. We'll go to Puerto Rico. We went for over 2 weeks. We did mostly homestays. So we really embedded ourselves in these communities. We made some amazing lifelong friends. We've since been back, I don't even know, 6 times. We've brought other friends with us. We brought other families with us, other educators. I've brought students. But we went just weeks before Hurricane Maria happened. So then when Hurricane Maria happened, I was kind of like caught in this emotional like moment of recognition that these places and spaces and people that I had really in a very short amount of time grown to just feel so intrinsically attached to were suffering in a way that I couldn't really understand but also couldn't do anything about. And thankfully I was able to make some connections with some individuals on the ground who, you know, they'd hiked like miles to get to a cell phone tower. And I'm like, hey, what can I do? Like, I can't send anything to you. Can I Venmo you money? Which you can't, because with cell towers down or electricity down, it's like, what can I do? And one of my friends at the time, Molly, she said, all you can do is you can just show up for us and you can care about us. And then you can tell our story to other people to get them to care too. And so I went to my advisor and I was like, I don't know if I can even focus on work right now. Like I'm caught in what I'm seeing and women screaming from rooftops and babies not being fed. And I was like, you know, what do I do with all that? And it's kind of ironic because I teach about mothering and I teach crisis communication and organizational communication. So I actually like teach this stuff. But I hadn't really thought about that piece of that puzzle in connection to the intersection of gender and culture. And it wasn't actually even something that was on my radar of anything I would have ever imagined researching. But my advisor at the time was like, okay, go like dive into that, research that, think about that, write about that, reflect on that, see what you can find. And I stumbled across Fothergill's book called Heads Above Water, which is a book written about the Grand Forks flood. And I read this book and went, I want to do this. Like, this is what I want to do. How do I do this? And my team of people were like, this is how you do this. This is how we're going to do this. This is what you need to know. And really helped me kind of try to find a path through it, which included like boning up on O'Reilly's like mattress-centric feminist work and my advisor, Patty Soderin, her own feminist rhetorical resilience work. And so I just like, it's funny that it was all there the whole time, but it took these sort of little micro moments for me to put the pieces together and really like find a passion for something that if you would have asked me if this is what I would be doing and loving 10 years ago, I would have been like, what? Why?
That is amazing. And I love the personal details so deeply intertwined in the research of what you do and what you write. I think that is incredible. And what an incredible journey to like get you to where you are today, teaching and studying and researching what you are researching, which is incredibly relevant and important and above all fascinating. So you've done field work in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. Can you describe what that experience was like and how it shaped the questions you wanted to ask as a researcher?
Yeah, and that's and it's kind of interesting because prior to that, I hadn't really done anything of this scope or magnitude. You know, it's just kind of things that at the time I was like an instructor, and so you're looking at what other people do, and you're like, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And you're like, but how do they do that? And you think like you need all these tools and resources and skills to be able to do that. And I would say like to begin, and I have to like preference this with, one of the things that I kind of study, right, is the relationships and the communication networks that evolve through those relationships and that mobilizing the work that these women are doing on the island. And that is the exact same thing that I had to do in order to be able to even conduct this kind of project with the scope and the money that I needed and the team of researchers that I had to bring with me. I would say that it's fundamentally, shaped me as a researcher. It's fundamentally shaped me as a person. I arrived expecting to document disaster recovery. When I went, it was 2 years post Hurricane Maria. And instead, what I found was an island that was still not even in what I would consider recovery, but was still in this phase of discovery. And I found mothers, women in particularly, but mothers in particular, who were still living inside disaster long after headlines had faded. I mean, it took them a year to get electricity. So by the time I was there, they had electricity, but still struggling inside infrastructure failures that were ongoing. So the power outages were still happening. They are to this day still happening. Water shortages were still happening. Medical supplies were still delayed. And yet in the middle of all this instability, these mothers were doing some of the most intentional, enriching, redesigning and redeveloping of care systems, and they were doing it from scratch. I think also being welcomed into their homes, their clinics, their community spaces. It made the human dimension of that disaster kind of painfully clear for me. Women's stories of laboring by flashlights, rationing insulin, navigating just their lives, caring for their babies in conditions that are, as a mother myself, just unimaginable. And so I went kind of with this general question of like, tell me what it was like, because I didn't really have an understanding of what it was like, and I didn't want to presuppose my own assumptions. I wanted them to sort of be the experts in their own lived experience. And I wanted to sort of share those stories in a way that didn't re-narrativize their stories, but allow their stories to speak for themselves. And so instead of focusing on like how did they recover, it changed the questions I started asking to how are they actively reshaping the meaning of their care work under these conditions of now what is long-term systemic neglect, not just after the storm, but before the storm. And like what kinds of resilience are women even producing, and what cost is that to them? What does mother work look like when that system fails? So, I mean, ultimately it helped me sort of redefine disaster, looking at it from not a neutral event to something that's more socially constructed and produced and replicated. And then those consequences that are mediated through power, the privilege that comes with, even in my positionality, and then of course, gender. So it sort of, I would say, if I had to like put a sentence to that, it shifted the project from studying disaster's impact to studying the agency that's found within disaster and the expertise, the cultural frameworks as these women sort of rebuild, resist, reimagine their lives.
Yeah, that's incredible. Like the evolution of your research and how you've gotten to this point is truly fascinating. And it sounds like when you have done such field work, you've been met with folks there who have been welcoming, like you said, and pretty communicative in regard to like sharing and disclosing information, which I'm sure has definitely played a role in giving you something to go off of and kind of deal with and think about and write about in your research.
It wasn't always easy. So the other thing that I will say is like when I went to the island to originally do this work, I had several people who I already obviously had existing relationships with, or like, yes,
right.
Come, I'll talk to you. My friends will talk to you. But I encountered this other problem as I was going along, was that as I snowballed through those, do your snowball stuff, I was like encountering people who were like, why should I talk to you? Right? Are you just going to be another person who's going to come here? You're going to listen to our story. And then you're going to go off and you're going to benefit from that. And everything here for us will just stay the same. Right. So I also had to do a lot of repair and trust work with acknowledging the role that I play as a researcher and not seeing these women as just data points, but seeing them as co-creators in that knowledge production. And kind of once I started building that trust, it became, I was so fortunate that I had, so I had a team of researchers. I have to acknowledge them too. I would be like, so I brought a community health worker, one of my best friends with me actually, a community health worker. She's fluent in Spanish, a doula, and a mother. I brought her with me. She was nursing at the time, so her 18-month-old had to come with. So I also brought with me on this trip an infant. And I brought a student, actually, of mine who, again, fluent in Spanish, international studies background. And one of the things that I love the most about her is she's very critical. She always, challenges the perspective. So I knew that she would check me if I was like, well, as a mom, this is how I see it. She'd be like, well, actually, I'm not a mom, so I don't see it that way. And so I knew she would check me. And it took all three of us, because once we started finding people that wanted to talk to us, other people wanted to talk to us. There were other stories that people wanted to share. And you're navigating other things. You're navigating grief. You're navigating anger or frustration as well. So it is, in some cases, like, I just had to drop the questions and I had to just be present and listen.
Yeah.
And, you know, and maybe nothing comes out of that, but I'm present and accountable so that they feel heard to when nobody was coming for them.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely incredible. So in your work, you use Dutta's culture-centered healthcare model. For listeners who may not be familiar, can you explain what that model is and how it helps us understand community health in post-disaster contexts?
Yeah, so Dutta's work is largely, it is exactly as you said, it's a healthcare model. And so at its core, it's a model that's not really for humanitarian aid, but it asks us to sort of slow down and listen to people who are most affected by health insecurities or inequities, and to understand health disparity by centering the voices of those that are most impacted. And I think that this, like, in a way, it kind of maps nicely onto humanitarian, nicely is a weird word, but maps onto a humanitarian aid setting, because Dutta's model, it says, let's start with the people that are experiencing this, that are living that experience. Their cultural knowledge becomes expertise, and the barriers that they face as they access care. So it has like three tenets: culture, agency, and structure. So you're looking at health access, government support, infrastructure policies. You're looking at the values and traditions and knowledge foundations of the people that rely on those infrastructure points. And then how people use their own resources or their creativity or their sites of resistance. In some cases, I wrote an article about their anger as they navigate those challenges. And so when I map that on to a disaster environment, it shifts that. It says that, you know, healthcare becomes inseparable from food access, from housing stability, from social networks, childcare, transportation. I mean, the list goes on. And it really starts to highlight healthcare as wellness, as a whole system that's shaped by culture and maintained by community agency. So we can look at something like sexual health and wellness. You know, after a disaster, women can't access STD. Well, no one can access STD screenings, not even just women, but they can't access birth control. Individuals can't access their gender-affirming care, or we look at issues of gender-based violence in temporary shelters. We look at mental health services that get cut off, therapy and medications, and obviously clinics, you know, get closed. And so we have issues of medical needs that kind of go unserved. But what Dutta's model does here is that it says, okay, all of that is super relevant in terms of when structures collapse, but it's what happens after, in that third phase, or that like last phase, that recovery, the rebuilding phase. Yeah. And shaping how, even because culture shapes even how people interpret risk, how they even see risk. And if they've lived with risk their whole life, they might even not realize, because that risk becomes so embedded to them that they've just accepted that level of suffering. They've just accepted it. And the line keeps getting moved, and they sort of keep having to accept that. And so it says, like, how are they interpreting that risk, looking at their sense of shared resources. And I think the other thing too here is to be really clear that in the aftermath of disaster, the emergent needs of rescue and triage, of stabilizing that environment, that work is so important, because that's what needs to happen in order for recovery to begin. So we can problematize that, though, like in Dutta's work, thinking about culture or agency, you know, dropping cans of formula into an environment where they can't read the label.
Yeah.
That is a highly problematic mechanism. Even if it's intended to stabilize and triage, it in and of itself creates sometimes more barriers, or access to water or clean water might prevent someone from sterilizing or sanitizing the bottles they need to be able to make formula in a way that's safe. So then Dutta's model comes in and it says, like, how do we then reinvent that system or rebuild that system in a way that actually benefits the people that live in those communities without presupposing what we think they need. And they become the experts then, right? So now we're moving beyond like a clinical model of healthcare to making visible the ways, and of course in my work, women, are providing essential forms of public health through caregiving, through organizing, through mutual aid, and legitimizing that expertise that they have as they're sort of in their own right.
Yeah, absolutely. That was so well articulated and explained. So I think that, no, that's great for those who are unfamiliar with the model to be able to conceptualize that and understand that through the lens of your work is incredibly helpful. So your research highlights feminist organizing and the role of women in rebuilding health systems after disaster. What kinds of labor, visible and invisible, do women often take on in those moments of crisis and recovery?
Well, the short answer is they do everything.
Right.
Yeah, they do everything. Anderson, there's scholar Anderson writes that women are the shock absorbers for their families. And a lot of it goes unnoticed. You know, in the absence of these like reliable institutions, women were forced to find new ways to hold their home and family together, and they did that amidst the chaos. So there's a lot of literature out there that does exist about the relationship between gender and disaster, specifically when we think about climate change fueled disasters, which are a little different than some of the other stuff kind of going on in healthcare deserts, as you mentioned in my bio. Gender and climate disasters, they intersect, and there are disproportionate and systemic harms that specifically fall on women because they find themselves within the home navigating the gender division of labor, restricted access to resources, structural inequalities. I mean, there's obviously a lot of systemic barriers in employment and housing and other things that women face. So the visible labor part of this is that they are caring for your children, they're managing food, they're getting medical supplies, they're transporting family members, they're caring for elderly family members, navigating FEMA paperwork, checking on their neighbors, organizing community kitchens. They're pulling their FEMA packet meals together. They're coordinating donations. You know, in Puerto Rico specifically, you know, I saw midwives doing checks on pregnant women in the back of a pickup truck by flashlight. Grandmothers running daycares for their whole neighborhoods so that women could go stand in line. But it's that invisible labor that, for me, shapes that recovery the most. So women are managing what I would say is like the emotional temperature of a household. This sense of mom will handle it. Soothing the fear, they're maintaining routines, they're holding space for grief and confusion. They're creating a sense of normalcy for their children. They're one of my favorite things that I wrote was that they're disguising emergency management plans as bedtime routines. They're ensuring that the stuffies are packed in their go bags, or that they have their favorite character on the cover of their fruit snacks.
Yeah.
Right. That emotional labor is a form of risk management, and reducing the fear improves the safety of their family, and it also improves the decision-making ability of that family. So in this way, that invisible labor, which of course is often unrecognized, rarely compensated, and deeply gendered, it's a part of that social fabric of the community. I'll also mention too that it's interesting that I went 2 years later, and then I've been talking to them a little bit, obviously through COVID. Like, there's been other scaffolding disasters that continue to happen in their lives. They've become like archivists for their families. Like in Fothergill's work, she actually writes about how they kept family albums and like preserved pictures for their families, even amidst like this catastrophic flooding. But it's things like shouldering the burden of decision making for things like, where do we go for help? What do we ration today? How do I keep this baby safe? How do I get my toddler to eat canned green beans for the 10th day in a row? Is it safe to let them play in this river when they haven't showered in a week? And those gendered pressures, they not only shape how disasters are lived, but how that recovery unfolds for them in the later sections or parts of that recovery, as they become sort of architects, of their own, or the backbone of their own community resilience. Yeah.
That's fascinating. There's so many things there that are like, I could dive into probably for hours with you.
I know, when you scheduled an hour, I was like, she doesn't know me. She doesn't know that, like, I could go on. It's so, there's so much nuance and texture and tiny little moments. Like, there's one of my moments I wrote about these mothers that met in a mall playscape. The mall was open. The stores weren't open, but the mall itself, they opened up, and they gathered at this playscape because it was like a safe place for their kids to play. And one of the mothers described that scene as sad silence. They didn't want to talk about the routine stuff of mothering, like, oh, are they sleeping, oh, teething, or walking, but they also didn't want to talk about what they were in the middle of because it was so traumatic. And so they just kind of sat there and shared this very intimate space with each other, and through that sort of form these friendships that crossed so many boundaries. They crossed political boundaries, they crossed economic boundaries, they crossed geographic boundaries, and to this day there are 4 women that I have spent a lot of time with that, despite all of that, have still maintained a friendship that has like carried them through COVID. It's carried them through a lot of other family crises as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, like entering the conversation of like social support and how these women have given and received support to one another, and just kind of within and intertwined within their communities as well. Like what does that look like, and how has that impacted their ability to take on the labor that they have and kind of have been that backbone of their families and of their households? Like, how has that benefited them? It's just like
and naming it,
fascinating,
validating it,
right?
As like O'Reilly was like, unmasking it, so that we can actually see this like lived reality of mothering. Because motherhood in and of itself, there's a lot of pressures, right? Intensive mothering, there's a lot of like good and bad mothering, there's the motherhood wars, there's like all this stuff. But then you like kind of get into it, and when we look at feminist organizing, like even just the prodromal of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, women weren't just coping. They weren't just like passive recipients. They weren't just victims of this. They were active in rebuilding and reimagining care, creating alternatives so that it worked better, not just for them and their mothering and their family, but for their communities too.
Yeah, absolutely. That is beyond fascinating. Okay, next question. So, you've written about the idea of motherwork and the next new normal. What do those terms mean in the context of your research, and how do they help us understand the ongoing nature of recovery?
Oof. Okay, so I have to first, Patricia Hill Collins and Andrea O'Reilly, they're the ones that sort of obviously pioneered the term motherwork. And it captures it. I mean, same thing with like thinking of resiliency nets. It captures the idea that mothering is more than just a private individual role, or that it's something that has to be in neoliberal terms, like intensive and only something that I can do and only something that I can provide for my children. But it is also collective. Mothering is political, and it is dramatically tied to survival. So in disaster context, mother work itself, in this case, like we talked about how the visible and invisible, it's the labor of making chaos livable. Preparedness isn't just like a checklist. So that's what I like to call the normal. That's like what happens before the storm. It's like the preparation that comes, the quiet, anticipatory, effective labor that's designed to hold their children steady, hold their family steady, even if the like sky is falling around them. And then post the immediate crisis, when it's the rain has stopped enough and the wind has stopped enough for them to leave their house, that's when this like new normal begins, right? That's when you have power grids that are failing, and now you're mothering in an environment that, again, like I said before, is like sometimes it's like sort of wild. It feels almost unimaginable to think about women waking up at 4 a.m. so that they can boil 12 gallons of water so that they have water through the day, or washing their clothes by a river for a year. Like that is what became their new normal. But then as things kind of come back online, as the social infrastructure starts to improve, as people can literally drive now to see people, or maybe even get access to their neighbors up the block, now we start to kind of see what I've sort of considered the next new normal. And that's the it's not just the daily labor of keeping life moving forward and doing whatever it takes to rebuild a sense of home and make that home feel stable. It's also the paradox of the contradictions. It's vital and empowering, but often invisible and exhausting. You're like, you want to reproduce caregiving labor that feels more agentive to you and is more self-fulfilling for you as a human, as a person, not just because you're a mother, but it's also tied to community survival. So you've got all these other threads. But it remains this like site of power even in places where inequity is reproduced. So when I think of mother work in terms of that new normal, it's like reframing the idea that women, they're not just, like, and I think this was before, but they're not just beneficiaries of aid, they're like central architects in that community recovery, and capturing the reality that recovery isn't linear. It's cyclical, it's constantly shifting, it's layered. It's more than coping, it's like redefinition. And they're doing this. One of the mothers said it's mothering on the march, and that it shaped her in a new way, and she realized she couldn't go back to what she was doing before. Right. That whatever was going to happen now had to be different, because it is a constant threat every season, every cycle, every time a storm cloud looks too dark. You're like, is this going to happen to me again? So then when they do that next new normal, it's like thinking more about, against the cyclical nature of like, now I'm coming back to the beginning again. And how do I want to live differently and actively reshape my life for the long term?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. The idea of it being cyclical and having to like consistently and pretty regularly like go through that mental process as a mother and through like that mother work.
Yeah, I took students to Puerto Rico in 2023, and I took them in the fall, which was a particularly unique choice, knowing that it's like hurricane season, and there were some tropical storms that were coming, and I was tuned in to all the island data, and I had first responders, and so I was like really well kind of aware of what was happening. But I went to Walmart, and I was like, I'll stock up on water, and I'll make sure that we've got some stuff in case the power will probably go out. And my team leader was with me, and she says, look around you, look at what's happening. And like, you look and you see carts full of Ensure, carts full of powdered milk, carts full of water. And you realize that they're doing this preparation work, even though what we knew was coming was minimal. They're still doing it as if it's going to be what Hurricane Maria was, because they're always going to live with that experience.
Yeah.
And that it's like heartbreaking, but it's also, again, my husband asks me all the time, why do you do this work? Because it seems so sad, and it seems so like, yeah. And I'm like, no. It's actually really not. It's so inspiring and magical. The things that people in general, but just like women, are coming up with within their communities as a way to say, you know what, not again. That's not going to happen again. And when it will happen again, but what's going to happen to me will be different. What's going to happen to my family is going to be different. That's going to look different for us, because no one's coming to help us. And that was like a phrase that I heard a lot, was no one was going to come to help them. And no one did come for like a really long time. No one came. And so they just have this expectation that they're on their own, and they want to see that look a little different.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you've mentioned that your work bridges disaster studies and organizational communication. How do these two fields inform each other in your research? Excuse me.
I mean, naturally they speak to one another. Disaster studies helps us understand sort of broader structural failures when systems are collapsing, communities that are vulnerable, inequalities becoming amplified by a particular crisis or even sutured in place. But organizational communication looks closely at how people coordinate, share information, create meaning,
right,
build those systems together. Yeah. So when you kind of put those two together, you see community development in action. And in Puerto Rico, well, just in general, whenever there's a crisis, like, communication doesn't stop. it doesn't stop. WhatsApp networks get created to share medical supplies. Community birthing hubs become, they emerge. Informal mutual aid groups emerge. People are training people to do lactation support in parking lots. It's not just random acts of kindness. It's organized strategic responses to systemic gaps. And so disaster studies gives us a context for why those systems have to emerge, and organizational communication helps us to understand how people build them. Mm-hmm. It's like a bridge for me that spotlights. It's a bridge that spotlights sort of that communities are not passive recipients of aid; they're organizers.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's like I said earlier. It's kind of ironic that in all of this, I didn't see that piece because it's like a natural fit for what I teach, for what I do.
Yeah.
I wasn't, I guess, maybe given the moment or the opportunity to really think deeper about those connections.
No, that totally makes sense that they go hand in hand and they speak to one another. And that was really well explained for those who are maybe kind of needed that gap bridged of information. Absolutely. So in your upcoming project, you're partnering with a local group launching a community health center to fill the gap left by Planned Parenthood closure. How did that partnership come about, and what does this collaboration mean for you personally and professionally?
Well, it's sort of, I don't know what word to use, but the woman that I brought with me on my original research project, like I said before, Kristen, she's my best friend. She is a doula. She's a community health worker. She's actually a part of this project. And so it's just kind of one of those things where, I'm having lunch with a friend and we're sitting in my living room and she's telling me all this cool stuff that she's doing. And I'm like, whoa, hold up, right? Like, tell me about that. I have friends who are midwives here, friends that are kind of just like all involved in this. Oddly, like my social circle is like all involved in this, and it's one of those moments where you're like, wait a second, what's happening? So that partnership is sort of starting to grow in a very organic way. So we've had a few things happen here in the UP. So Planned Parenthood closed their clinic here in Marquette. And that has meant now that there's no Planned Parenthood in the entirety of the UP. There is a Planned Parenthood clinic downstate Michigan. But that is, it's hours. I think it's like 5 or 6 hours from us now. We have also seen the closure of 2 hospital birthing units as well. Mm-hmm. And so that has really created it's created a healthcare desert. An enormous vacuum for reproductive, gender-based maternal health care. I don't think maybe people just really don't understand what services Planned Parenthood provides and the gap that Planned Parenthood fills for our healthcare system more widely. Yeah. And so what's also happened is before that even started to emerge, as the Planned Parenthood was closing, there were like stories that you started to hear of people that were like, all of a sudden, teenagers that are not having access to, contraception or even accurate information about contraception. Women who financially can't go and afford a mammogram through the hospital or getting their mammograms are now like, what do I do with that? A friend whose trans daughter is like now left without their shots and a trusted doctor to do their appointments. And so there's a local group, it's got an MD, like I said, a doula, there's midwives, community health workers, other members, they're all women, members of the community that started stepping up and were like, okay, wait a second, who then takes on these responsibilities, right? Like the college medical center can assume some of the responsibilities, but who does like medical terminations? Like how do we make sure that people are not having to travel or because they might not be able to or shouldn't have to travel 6 hours? And so again, it's like it doesn't take a major hurricane to help us see that we need to rebuild something from the ground up to meet those needs, that it's happening right here in our own communities, right at home, right across the street. And again, because my work focuses on that intersection of gender and care system, maternal resilience, it's like those paths naturally cross. So right now I see myself as a little bit more of a collaborator. because of the element of advocacy. One of the things that they're doing is they're going to be traveling to look at other birthing centers. And I'm like, wait a second, I have one for you. We need to go to Puerto Rico. You need to look at other birthing centers, not just birthing centers here in the mainland, birthing centers. Yeah, like branching out, making sure that we have this like wide range cultural perspective, that we're making sure everyone is at that table. But Central Day Mom, what Central Day Mom did in Puerto Rico is in of itself its own case study on feminist organizing and healthcare. And so, yeah, like, it's just kind of interesting that personally this partnership for me, it means a great deal because it allows me to bridge that research to my values. But it also allows me to show people, again, that work doesn't just have to be done in the wake of a catastrophe. You know, it's work that actually has to be done now before a catastrophe even happens.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this is phenomenal. And I personally think it's great that it's like your entire social circle that has come together and made this collaboration come to be. I think that's like actually really cool. And it's probably giving you a new dynamic because you do have personal relationships with these people. You're able to collaborate on a different level compared to just like out of the blue collaborating with an acquaintance or God forbid like a stranger and trying to navigate that connection between the two of you for this collaboration. You guys already have a strong foundation since you guys are a social circle. So this sounds just like incredible and phenomenal work for you guys and your community.
Yeah. Yeah, and it extends like it's, you know, it's strange too how it constantly keeps like it keeps extending. And I mean that's part of the work of community development, community work. And also I think part of the work of like just qualitative research in general. You hear a story and that person says, I've got a friend who has a story like that, and it takes you in all these really wonderful directions. I would have never thought that there would be this direct connection between work that feels so far away at some points in time to work that's like literally right here.
Right.
And it's like there's even like it's like a Kevin Bacon thing, but my friend, it's like her brother's friend from grad school is a midwife in Puerto Rico who it's, you're like,
oh yeah,
it just keeps kind of coming full circle. Which is really wonderful for me. I mean, it makes my research life a little easier, although exponentially more complex because I want to take on this and I want to take on that and I want to do this. It does give me a much more intimate ability to do this work where I don't have to work on cultivating it. It already exists.
Exactly.
But that still comes with ethical tensions and dynamics that I have to be mindful of. How much do I bracket? How much do I get involved?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear more, see more, read more about this entire project. So, what are some of the communication challenges you've seen communities face when trying to rebuild systems of care, especially for women and families after disaster or institutional loss?
Oogie. I could give you a million. I guess I'll start with information fragmentation. Okay. It is a huge challenge. So in the case of, and specifically, and I'll always reference Puerto Rico because, I mean, one of my like long-term dreams is to do sort of comparisons of looking at, say, like what happened in North Carolina, maybe what happens in the wildfires where are the similarities and the overlaps, but also where are the uniquenesses and the challenges that exist in those sort of specific unique places. Because in Puerto Rico, without internet access, without electricity, you literally have an information, just like a complete absence of it. You can't get online and get a CDC fact sheet anymore on gastritis or scabies. You can't register, if you just had a baby, you can't register your baby to have a birth certificate so that you can leave the island and go to another country or go somewhere else because that child isn't officially recognized. Right. Even as your own, which is, I have a really interesting story about a woman that she came to New Jersey and they on an emergency flight and they made her go through a physical exam to prove that she had a baby so they could prove that baby she was holding was hers when they could have just like done a finger prick test. Really wild, because all she had was a letter from her midwife that said, a handwritten letter, because there was no way to type it out, like a handwritten letter that said, yep, I was there, this baby was born. because she hadn't registered. There was no official paperwork that was done. The other thing is people as institutions close, people don't know. They don't know where to go. They don't know who's providing what resources are even available. And then what happens is, and this is a little bit of like my crisis communication work, but information then starts circulating through rumor and informal networks, outdated websites, and people, families, individuals, communities, they start sort of piecemealing together all this information that can actually have like really devastating consequences. I mean, can you imagine walking? In one case, someone said they walked like 8 miles somewhere because they had learned that someone might have gas and got there and there was none. Or you show up to a FEMA table expecting that maybe you're going to be able to get some financial resources, and they're like, well, we can't help you until you go over to this other table and do this other thing.
Yeah.
And so that, I guess that leads like to the part of navigating these bureaucracies. FEMA, Medicaid, hospital systems. I mean, I got to call my insurance company today and fight a bill, right? That in of itself is a time, labor intensive process. It's also a process that is something we're not really, as just individuals, we're not really like trained on to know how to access these complex forms or procedures that assume stability, free time, transportation, English fluency. So for mothers, and I'll say like single mothers too, independent mothers, it creates this sort of impossible communication burden. Sometimes they have to have translators for their family. Healthcare costs that are skyrocketing, and people trying to figure out like, how do I get my money? How do I get paid?
Right.
Where do I even go? All that, and then having to navigate that. And then I think maybe the third thing, just for time's sake here, is like the mistrust, right? That we already have. I think we've seen the erosion currently going on around the credibility of the CDC. The information on vaccine safety and vaccine protocols, the wild claims that are going on around there. It's like now all of a sudden, who do I go for information? Who becomes the person that's actually going to help me and give me information that isn't just going to continue to replicate a system of precarity for me? And so, with the Planned Parenthood stuff, my local community, Puerto Rico, wherever we want to take that, women, mothers, they're weighing who they can trust with their bodies, with their children. It shapes how that communication flows, because when trust is broken, people stop reaching out to someone until they prove themselves to be reliable or consistent or culturally attuned. And again, because that labor is often invisible and isn't formally recognized, isn't compensated, that means that their communication needs aren't recognized either. And so they're doing all this coordination, making healthcare appointments, trying to find food access, but they're doing it with no system designed with that labor in mind. And in other places, you have things like, there was a forced sterilization program that happened in Puerto Rico. So there is a generalization, like a generational distrust in medical personnel. There is a distrust in some cases Western medicine. There's a distrust in us because of that colonial relationship. Like, why should I trust you, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so when we look at those like challenges together, it sort of becomes clear here that it is about communication systems, but it's also about like that trust, that access, navigating bureaucracy, which you don't even have to be in a crisis to like know that that's the struggle.
Absolutely. No, this all highlights just such important aspects of your work in terms of sharing these stories and sharing this information to people who otherwise might not think about it, organizations who might not be thinking in this way of how to better the communication system for these different contexts, especially within disaster and having to recover from that. So I think this is like just such an important element of the work that you are doing, and to kind of just highlight that, as well as being able to apply it to a variety of different contexts that would be related or similar. How does a feminist theoretical lens change the way we understand humanitarian aid and healthcare?
Okay, so back to the trust, right? Back to these systems of oppression and inequality. As women, we are already part of an oppressed group. When you factor in race, class, you factor in mothering, you get this double, triple bind of additional oppressions that exist. And so the feminist theoretical lens fundamentally shifts where we look and whose experiences we treat as authoritative, or with that expertise. And so traditionally, and I want to be mindful to also, my students know me well. They'll know I'll critique everybody. Like I critique myself. I'll critique everybody. There is a place for traditional humanitarian aid. 100%, we cannot deny that. Especially when we think about, like I said, the sort of triage immediate needs. But traditionally, humanitarian aid focuses more on like institutions, logistics, technical fixes, policies, which again, they're important, but they are only a part of that story. And so that feminist perspective gives us more story. It asks us, like, who is doing the day-to-day work of keeping people alive, let alone well and connected? Whose labor is holding that system together? And maybe even asking the question, why is that labor undervalued? And so when we apply a feminist lens to this big picture, we can see that crises land unevenly, specifically to women, especially mothers, low-income women, women of color, queer and trans people, parents, and they bear those disproportionate burdens. We notice, like I said, that invisible work, whether it's emotional care, information sharing, coordination, negotiation, that kind of has to happen. And that becomes sort of part of that story. We get to question, and that's like my favorite part again, is like questioning these power structures that claim objectivity, but often then privilege a male, Western, or institutionalized perspective and foreground the power, the relationships to power, and prioritize those voices of the marginalized communities. So it pushes, for me, it's always pushed me to interrogate my own assumptions, the assumptions of external environments that are built into those aid programs, but just generally speaking, built into the way we assume mothering looks like or should look like. Mm-hmm. They also, and also, like, I would say humanitarian aid frameworks often also assume a nuclear family unit.
Yeah.
And they have, there's just a lot of like assumptions about transportation, and I think that for me, ultimately, it reframes humanitarian aid not as charity delivered from the outside, but as something co-created within communities. And it recognizes that women are doing this critical work of survival even after those organizations leave, to sort of maybe help make them more inclusive, cultural or context driven. It's centering their stories. Like I really dug into the literature and I was like, okay, where are the women's stories? And I found, and like I said, like Fothergill's work, I found some literature, but there should be more. And I was like, what is going on here? Like, there's a huge gap. Yeah. And in retelling, we don't want to reposition them. We want them to to have agency, to tell us, to be the experts, to give them the expertise. And even if we can't like monetize that labor, to at least recognize it and value it and see it.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that you brought that up, because I feel like in a variety of conversations I have had just within the last few years especially, whether it's doing this or just like in other research spaces, it's kind of like that's continuously recognized, is that there's such a gap of information, a gap of stories, and that agency is just so important. And which is why conversations like this are important, to kind of just like reiterate the importance of this and how this could be incredibly progressive for our discipline, and just to have these voices heard, like everything we can learn from that and beyond just like a communicative standpoint is just wildly important.
Yeah. I'm not, I started out my career doing quantitative data analysis. And so I love a good stats, or a good number. And it's like, okay, well, we've got, 75% of women that are struggling to breastfeed with limited support in these environments. And that's very telling. But then I go in and I ask them, why? How? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? What are the successes? What are the opportunities? And that for me gives me more. That says, okay, there are places and spaces here where there needs to be more investment, but that investment has to come with those community members, with those mothers at the table, helping us guide that work.
So true.
Because otherwise we just layer on top of them our own needs and our own identities and our own values, and we're not really doing the work of community driven, community building work. That would be long term for them, because that's just like short term. I think one of the quotes that someone said was like spreading peanut butter on everybody. It's like, what do we do with that? That you're like just spreading it on, and you're like, here we go. And then you leave, and then they're kind of back to doing it on their own. And so, bringing those voices to the table. There was a book. My mind is blank on him, and it's so tragic that it is, because he literally is the World Health Kitchen, the guy that runs World Health Kitchen. He wrote a book about feeding people in the aftermath of Puerto Rico. God, I'll have to email you the title of the book. You can link it. And one of the things he said was so interesting was he went to this meeting of all these like big FEMA, Red Cross, humanitarian aid people, and he was like, where are the people that own the restaurants? Where are the cooks? Where are the food distributors? Where are your truck drivers? Why are they not here? And then, looking at the fact that in that environment, he was like, most of the people cooking the food are women. Where are they?
Yeah.
Why are they not here? And like, what kitchens were allowed to be used, and what food was being used? It's like, there's food here. Use that food. It's just it was kind of wild that, they came in and they sort of presupposed this is what we're going to do. And that works in the moment, it works, but long after we're gone, you still have women that have schools down the block that are closed, and now they have nowhere to send their kids. And so you still have a gap that exists. And they're experts. They've lived this experience. They know better than I know. And who better to tell us than them?
Exactly. Yeah. So my final question for you is, across your work, community voices seem to play a central role. How do you center those voices in your research process, and what have they taught you that theory alone might miss?
Ooh. It's
and I'm going to take that back. That was not my final question for you. I still have a couple more that I want to get to.
Keep going. It's funny because like I teach theory, and I'm like, theory is, and you're like, theory is your guide, theory is your... Right. And now theory for me can in some ways be kind of like a little bit of a detour, because it isn't just a methodological or theoretical choice for me. It's an ethical one. The people that I mentioned earlier, people that I work with, they're not just subjects. They're partners. They're co-creators, co-thinkers, knowledge holders. They're experts in their own lives. And that means several things, right? It means that, and I saw this already too, but like I spend a lot of time listening before I even ask a question. Yeah. And it might mean that my questions just change completely. It might mean that I have to change direction, because again, I'm letting them guide with their lived experience rather than coming with an assumption as to what I think they should be telling me. So having them shape that direction of the interview, or maybe the focus group, because they know what matters most. Yeah. And then I return, that member check becoming really important. I return to the communities with drafts, with ideas, with what I think are like my results, and allow them to respond, correct, redirect. No, that's not what I meant. Here's how I want you to rephrase it. Here's how I want you to see that. Prioritizing, for me, I guess one of the hardest parts has been prioritizing everyday language over academic jargon. There's like this tension that exists in wanting to like say things that aren't necessarily academic, instead of like, having more of the kind of like prose, the citey prose that kind of comes. It's like telling the actual story. But the goal is shared understanding, not gatekeeping. And so that is kind of at that heart for me. Yeah. I also think it's really important that I honor their native language to ensure that translation represents their intentions, their emotions, their experiences. One of the things that I did is I said, okay, do this interview in your native language. And I don't speak any Spanish whatsoever. So that was like really hard for me as in terms of an ethical value, moral like debate was to meet them where they're at was a challenge for me. Bringing some translators with me was very helpful, and making sure that my translators were a part of that direct creation process instead of just like sort of mouthpieces. but allowing them to do their interview in whatever language was their language of that, of choice, because there are some things that don't translate. And so in places where that language doesn't translate, I try to use that actual language, even if it's something that we can't put into a Google Translate and know what it means. I provide their interpretation because, again, and I'm constantly asking myself this one question. I give this question to my students. Are you amplifying their voices or are you overshadowing them? And so what community voices teach me is what theory can't. That was like the hardest part of an academic scholar's be like, wait a second, everything I know to be true is based on theory. But theory can identify patterns, but it like I said, it doesn't wake up at 4 a.m. to do that work. It doesn't walk 8 miles to do that work. It doesn't. Right. It doesn't explain in some ways the piles of faith and frustration and hope and fear and all of that, how they intersect in a single micro moment.
Right.
It gives you a nuance too. I have tended to think of it as like this big thing, but then that nuance gives you messy, born out of necessity rather than choice. Like, it's not easy. That's like, if you want an easy thing to do, don't do this, because it's very complicated and contradicting. And sometimes you think you have a pretty good idea, and then you return to your member check and they're like, no. And you're like, okay, I missed that. What did I miss? Go back to the beginning. It keeps me grounded, keeps me accountable, and it ensures that my work just isn't about people, but it's for and with them, like that friend said.
Yeah, I love that. So what advice would you give to scholars and practitioners who want to do community engaged work but don't know where to start?
Start by listening, not by diagnosing. That is a very hard part of being an academic, is I'm like, well, I have a solution for you.
Oops. Yeah.
I have a solution for you. Oh, please tell me that's not your email, because mine's been...
No, it's just like I opened a window and then like it just started happening.
Mine's like mine dings all day. It starts by I feel whenever people's emails are dinging, I'm like, oh no, I'm so sorry.
Right.
I come to it and I'm like, I have a solution for you, and it's like, wait a second, don't come with a prepackaged solution. Again, look back at that culture center approach, slow down, enter that community or that space or that home with humility and curiosity. Ask what do you need? What do you already know? What has worked before? What barriers are in your way? And be prepared for them to critique you, right? And take that.
Right.
Like, I see that. Okay. All right. Yep. Noting. Recognizing, like I said before, recognizing local knowledge as expertise. I look at like midwives, for example. Midwives in some places like states, Puerto Rico, they're like not even in some cases recognized. But yet they're like legit healthcare experts who can do so many things for your neighborhoods, and they're experts in their own right. And these insights, for me, they should carry the same weight as those who are doing policymakers or even consultants. Right. I mentioned, bringing people to the table, making sure everyone's at that table. So it means more than just like, we love a good subcommittee. We love a good community advisory board, but it means co-developing programs, budgets, timelines, all of that with the goals of the people who are the most impacted, and compensating community members for their time and their labor, and involving those local partnerships, building local relationships that are long-term, not just transactional. So not just like in the moment. We're not just studying them to abandon them. It's slow, it's reciprocal, it's sustained, it requires you to show up. Even when that grant ends, you still have to figure out ways to continue to show up. And then, I guess, maybe don't become part of the structural barrier yourself, right? Like, design your study with an intention so that you're not creating more barriers. Just like you and I are meeting today online, there were participants that couldn't come to me. Okay, well, I might be able to come to you, or maybe there's an alternative way that we can write letters so that they don't have to rely on those systems that aren't serving them. And I think, and this is like what I would tell my students, like I'm just, finishing up advanced interpersonal. Like, communities are not problems to fix. they're partners with valuable insights and lived experience, and and letting them sort of be that expert, instead of like diagnosing. It's very easy for me, because as a crisis communicator, I'm like, I have the solution, but
right.
I don't know if I do.
Yeah, no, I love all of that, and especially highlighting just like that importance of like the connection piece, connecting with communities, connecting with people, not making it transactional, and like really fostering that is like that's just resonating with me, and it seems so important.
And it's almost like counterintuitive to the academic environment, right? Because we're kind of taught like, do a research project, publish, do a research project, publish, do a research project, present, and it like, yeah, and I wanted something for me that was gonna like hold me for my whole career, and inspire me for my whole career, and keep going, but also like returning back. And it is a challenge, because if you're doing a project that requires 3 years, you're not going to be in that publishing cycle, right? So you have to recognize like it isn't a punishment to the academic. It is a gift of yourself to communities that need that.
Absolutely. So important. Okay, now my last question. I was a little premature there. Finally, if there's one thing you want listeners to take away about communication, care, and resilience, what would it be?
It's like at the end of my dissertation defense, she's like, what does resilience mean to you? And I was like, honestly, I think I hate the word resilience now. After having studied it for so long. But milestones matter. They matter, but they don't capture the full story of what people are actually living through. So for me, there's like big R and little r. And recovery is big R. It's relational. Yeah. It's emotional. It's ongoing. And it's shaped by like the everyday labor of the people, in my case, especially women and mothers. And so it looks like, recovery can look, and it looks different for everybody. Like it literally looks different from one house across the street to the next. I had one couple of mothers that I interviewed, where one household was like, they literally live across the street from one another. One house got completely flooded out. The other didn't. So one house had knee deep, thick, black, gross mud, right? That had to be like shoveled out. And the family across the street, they didn't have that. They had some windows blown out. They had some roof situations, but they were largely like unscathed. We'll say that delicately. And they said, you're going to come over here and you're going to live with us. We don't know each other. We're just neighbors, but you're going to come over here. You're going to live with us. We're going to move our house around. Each couple has their own bedroom. The kids will be in one room, and we're going to make sure that your house gets back on track. So that looks a little different than, say, neighbors just sharing food when supplies chains, right? Or midwives rebuilding trust with other local healthcare systems and getting commissions to come into hospitals. Like it's going to look very different, but recovery is that return of, and this is actually, I get this from one of my mothers who I interviewed. She said it was the return of laughter. It was the return of ritual, of ordinary moments that made every day feel like a day again. She said it was the slow return of stability. But it doesn't mean ease. It's like adaptation under like still continued strain, because again, even though it's a new normal, man alive, like the systems are still not working the way that they need to, right? Electricity's still going out. Here we still have a healthcare disaster. So it is adaptation under strain. It's also like grieving. Yeah. And I think that's the part of like recovery. We have this idea of like new and shiny and everything's like back together again. And like my friend, like she said, like the return of laughter. But recovery also involves a lot of grieving. It involves recognizing what won't come back. And that might mean a home. It might mean relationships. It might mean people that passed away in that experience, or a sense of security that you once had. And so that's why I like to use that term, sort of next new normal, because it's like there's no returning to what was, right? There's only creating new rhythms, new systems. And so what we understand as recovery for me is relational. It's communication. It's emotional. It's a big R.
Yeah. No, that's so well articulated and well put. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for being with me
Yeah.
today to talk to me about your awesome work, Dr. Potter. I really appreciate it.
Thank
And I'm
you.
really excited at the direction, like, the collaboration and everything that is on your horizon. I'm excited to read about and hear about. So thank you so much for being here.
I thank you for doing this podcast, because that's the other thing that's like so hard, right? Is like, for those of us that are holding on to things that I see as so valuable, and I want everybody to know about them, and I want everybody to care about them, and want everybody to like see them.
Yeah.
I publish it in a journal, and maybe four people will read it. And then you have to publish another article in another journal so that maybe 12 people will read it. And I'm always looking for places and spaces where those stories can be shared in a different way, where that work can be communicated to a wider array of scholars that might sit outside of somebody who who's researching a specific niche field. Because that happened to me, right? I just kind of was siloed into something, and I didn't realize that there was more out there. So I very much appreciate this, because if it weren't for things like this, I don't know if I would have even stumbled onto, right, the work that I do now. And I just think it's really amazing to bring a scholarship community, again, community development in action, to bring scholars together in a community where we're supported, where we can talk authentically about our experiences. Remove away, I mean, I'm still very much an academic, so I've tried to remove away a little bit of the academic jargon, right? Make it a little bit more conversational, but get into a space where we can share with one another. You do that a little bit at conferences, but I feel like you're also kind of moving from one thing to the next. So
very fast paced. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like I often say the phrase like "come chat with me," like COMM, communication.
Yeah.
With me.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Potter.
Thank you. Very much appreciate it.
And that brings us to the end of today's conversation with Dr. Sara Potter. I'm really grateful for the way she helped us think differently about disaster, recovery, and care, and for the reminder that communication plays a central role in how communities heal, organize, and move forward. If this episode got you reflecting on how care is structured, who carries it, or how culture and communication shape health and humanitarian work, I hope you'll carry those questions with you beyond this conversation. As always, thank you so much for listening and for being a part of Cultivate Talk. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss what's next. Until then, take care of yourself and keep cultivating conversations that matter.